For this video, we will discuss Peter's essay, When Bankers Rule, which was published in the October 1934 issue of the Catholic Worker.
When bankers rule, modern society has made the bank account the standard of values. When the bank account becomes the standard of values, the banker has the power. When the banker has the power, the technician has to supervise the making of profits. When the banker has the power, the politician has to assure law and order in the profit-making system. When the banker has the power, the educator trains students in the technique of profit making. When the banker has the power, the clergyman is expected to bless the profit-making system or to join the unemployed. When the banker has the power, the Sermon on the Mount is declared unpractical. When the banker has the power, we have an acquisitive, not a functional society. So many things in this easy essay. Peter just packs it all in there. Like the very first phrase of just, modern society has made the bank account the standard of values. That I mean, again, I mentioned in one of our other videos, like it's sometimes depressing to think like it's just as bad or maybe worse than it was back then. But this is something the Catholic workers generally like try to push against in our society. Like if you are poor, it is because you are flawed, or perhaps that your parents were flawed in some sort of way. Um, and it's a way to like deflect from this system, where certain people just have way too much and other people don't have what they need. And then so we see the inverse there, that like people with money are considered like inherently good in some kind of way, either like smart or just generally upright or something like that. And weirdly in the Donald Trump era, we saw that like one of his primary arguments was like, I have money, that is why I should be the leader. That in itself is a qualification. So the bank account being the standard of values, is just as true today as back then. Another line that like really stood out to me was talking about how the educator trains students in the technique of profit making. That idea of a technique of profit making, like it is its own skill or something like that. And I think in Peter's mind, it is not like a skill that like actually benefits society. It is part of that acquisitive society rather than the functional one. And like we see that in like ways that I think didn't exist back then either, with stuff like planned obsolescence and stuff like that. Like they know how to make like a fridge that'll last 35 years, like they used to do it 35 years ago. But like they figured out they can make more money if it breaks every 5 years and you have to buy a new one or whatever. And that is what this like profit making acquisitive system gives us. And like we've talked about on other essays, like I think sometimes it is hard to like imagine anything outside of like this is just how it is. And another thing that I thought of here was when the banker has the power, the Sermon on the Mount is declared unpractical. uh and so part of me wonders, like, well, the Sermon on the Mount is like a very difficult thing. Like it's like hard to go with. And I mean, Peter says like the difficult words in the book are the reason the book was written, in a different easy essay. But like, I don't know, would it feel more practical if I was not coming from this acquisitive society, not coming from this society that values profit making over everything else. Is my imagination, stunted in the same way? Um, so that was just a few of like the many things I think of when I read this one.
Yeah, thanks, Theo. Yeah, when you mentioned if our society wasn't, if the bankers didn't rule, but it reminded me of a conversation I had with a friend when I was first getting involved with the Catholic worker movement and discussing with these friends that knew nothing about the Catholic worker movement because I had read about it before I joined it, but still they didn't know much about the Catholic worker movement. But he was a Catholic friend and um, when I was talking about voluntary poverty and trying to live more simply, I remember him stating something along the lines that in the day of St. Francis of Assisi, voluntary poverty would be more acceptable. And I just took him at face value because I didn't really know that much about the life of St. Francis at that time. I'm not an expert or anything now, but I do know that, that there were breaks among the Franciscans because of their view of voluntary poverty. It became a huge issue at the time, and especially St. Clare with the women's order of for the Franciscans. I think it was viewed poorly. Francis's parents were embarrassed by his poverty and rejecting the family wealth, and it was viewed poorly enough on men of means doing this. But for women to participate, I think was often a scandal. and so I guess in that sense, and I don't think the banker, usury wasn't allowed. Bankers played a much smaller role in society then than they do today. But I think that does go along with your thought of even if bankers didn't rule, uh, these would be still hard words, and they've always been hard words. Um, but I do like how, and you touched on this, how he talks about how the banker has affected so many parts of life. And I think we can all think of the politician, but yeah, the education. Um, they definitely play a role in the growth of business schools, which now dominate most universities, and what's taught at technical colleges. And they're the driving force behind so much. Um, and I do like that line that um, the clergyman essentially, if he or she does not go along with this profit making system, will join the unemployed. Um, which I'm sure has, in certain cases, certain clergy have been dismissed, depending on if they're talking to a more wealthy congregation. If not dismissed, at least removed from that parish and put somewhere else um, where where their message wouldn't raise such a fuss.
Yeah, and just that the system requires too, in a certain way, the technicians and the politicians and the educators and the clergymen. Like it needs to be affirmed. I think people would not naturally pick the way things are set up now, uh, or at least the vast majority of the global population would not choose the way things are now. But that like ideology foundation is just so strong, and there are resources put into it, and that going back to like you mentioned the business school, like there's funding for that, there's donors, you know. So yeah, it needs this whole apparatus, and that whole apparatus is itself like resources. Like there are people like whose job it is to be like a lobbyist or something like that, or just like make sure that these like exploitative financial institutions continue to function, and that is like what they contribute to society and are like paid very well for it. And it's just, I don't know, in once I start thinking about this stuff, it's always just like wild to think that this is really how things work.
And there, in a previous essay, Peter had talked about, um, taking the commercialism out and putting religion in. And when we discussed that essay, you also, mentioned perhaps for some it might be more, it might sound better or be a better decision to just put in the word ethics. And um, now reading this essay, it reminds me my undergraduate degree was in accounting, and I don't recall. I am 98% certain that I never had to take an ethics course. Um, though I had to take, quite a few. I mean, most of my degree was business credits, accounting credits, finance credits, um, business law. I mean, that's really the closest thing I can even think of to what might be considered ethics, because in business law, we at least were taught for what was illegal. but uh, but just because something's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. So, in these, I'd assume there probably are some business schools that do require probably 3 credits of ethics, a single class, but I don't recall having one in the late 90s. And I'm assuming most schools it's probably completely absent.
Oh, I'm sure. And I'd be surprised though. I mean, I'm sure there are many good teachers out there if like those ethics classes are like really digging down like nitty-gritty like the foundations of capital, like Peter addresses like usury. Is it okay to live off the sweat of somebody else's brow? And hopefully they're talking about some of that, but it's definitely not a mainstream discourse in the dominant culture generally.